Hello and welcome to podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. You can subscribe to our show on iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or add our RSS feed to your podcatcher of choice. You can also follow us on Twitter or Google+, and please give us feedback. You can leave us a review on iTunes so that other people can find the show, send us a tweet, send us an email, send us a message on Google+, or leave a comment on our show notes. I would like to thank everyone who has donated to the show. Your contributions help us make the show sustainable. For details on how to support the show, you can visit our site at pythonpodcast.com. This episode is also sponsored by Zato, microservices, ESB, SOA, REST, API, and cloud integrations in Python. Visit zato.io to learn more about how to integrate smarter in the modern world. I would also like to thank Hired, a job marketplace for developers, for sponsoring this episode of podcast.init. Use the link hired.com/podcastinit to double your signing bonus.
We'd also like to put out the call for any Pythonistas out there who may have disabilities. If you are blind, if you need some other kind of special adaptation to program in Python, we would love to talk to you. We think that would be a really interesting window into the awesome diversity in the Python community. And so please get in touch with us at hosts@podcastinit.com.
Yeah, we would love to have a show so that other people can find out about your stories. And we're recording today on December 7th, 2015. Your hosts, as usual, are Tobias Macy and Chris Patty. And today we are interviewing some of the editors of the PEP process. So, Barry, could you please introduce yourself?
Okay, I'm Barry Warsaw, and I've been involved in Python for a long time, over 20 years. I currently work for Canonical, and they're the makers of Ubuntu Linux. So I work on the Ubuntu engineering team, on the foundations team. And so I do a lot of foundational work in Ubuntu and in Debian on trying to make the Python stack, keep it healthy and improving as we go along. So if there's a bug in Ubuntu or Debian with Python, then I'm probably the guy to blame.
And Chris, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Chris Angelico. I'm the newest PEP editor. I teach Python programming online, so I tend to see a lot of what people are doing in the real world with new programmers. And for the rest, I basically nerd out about Alice in Wonderland and Frozen and stuff like that. So yeah, I love editing PEPs because basically playing with words and text files is my life. I live on GitHub, pretty much.
Great. And what about you, David?
Hi, I'm David Goodger. I'm best known in the Python community as the creator of the DocUtils project, which includes restructured text. I'm originally from Montreal, Canada, but I'm currently living in Minnesota in the U.S., in a suburb of the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. I work at Medtronic as a systems engineer. I'm an avid cyclist and really enjoying the fabulous cycling around the Twin Cities, but I'm also mourning the end of the cycling season, unfortunately.
So how did you folks get introduced to Python?
So let's see. And the interesting thing is, in early 1994, I saw Complang Python, the news group, the Usenet news group, actually get created. And I've always been interested in languages and technology, so I checked it out, and I got bored pretty quickly because there was very little language stuff and a lot of Monty Python jokes, which, I love Monty Python. I'm a huge fan, but I didn't quite understand why there would be Monty Python skits and jokes in a Complang news group. So I sort of lost interest until later in 1994. I got hired by the Corporation for National Research Initiatives, CNRI. And we were doing a project called NoBots, which is essentially software agents that are able to move around the network to do various tasks or learn various things. And we started looking at Objective-C on the old Next machines, if anybody remembers the old Next machines. They were
Love those boxes, yeah.
Yeah, they're awesome. And we really liked Objective-C. I'd used Objective-C years before that in a previous job. And so we were sort of going down this track, and some of my old colleagues at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, they're a federal government research lab up in Gaithersburg, Maryland, had sent me an email and saying, hey, we're getting this guy over to the States to give a talk about this language called Python. And it sort of rejogged my memory about this news group. So I thought, okay, well, that's pretty cool. I'll go see some of my old friends and sit in on this workshop. And we did a little bit of research, and we saw that there was some really interesting Objective-C Python bridges that people were developing. So we thought, hey, at the very least, we can kind of pick Guido's brain and see what he thinks about these Objective-C Python bridges. And so the workshop, if I remember correctly, it happened in like November of '94, and there's about 20 of us. My colleague at CNRI, Roger Massey, was there, and some of the other, a few other people that you probably recognize from the Python community. Jim Fulton was there. I think Skip Montanaro was there. And we just totally fell in love with Python at this workshop. The one thing I remember we designed at the time were doc strings. I don't know if anybody remembers Python before doc strings, but that was one of the features that I remember having been developed at this workshop. So it was about 3 days. We really enjoyed it. Guido, of course, we just, really clicked with him. And then he went back to the Netherlands, and we went back to work. And sort of over the next couple of months, we sort of bandied about the idea of trying to actually hire Guido to see if he was interested in coming to the States and to work on this Objective-C Python bridge in more detail. So we kind of brought him over. We interviewed him. Bob Kahn, who is an internet luminary, one of the founding fathers of TCP/IP. He runs CNRI, and he really liked Guido, and so Guido kind of was ready to come to the U.S. at the time, and it just sort of all worked out. And I think he came over in April of 1995, and we sort of over the next 8 years moved all the Python infrastructure to the U.S., mailing lists, and we upgraded from CVS, I think at the time, to Subversion. So we just sort of pulled all the Python infrastructure, and I got really involved because Guido was, in the cube next to me within throwing distance. That's kind of how I got involved in Python in the early days.
That's a very interesting story and a great peek at some of the early history of the language, so thank you for that. Chris, how did you get introduced to it?
I first met Python back sometime in the 90s, probably late 90s, on OS2. My dad knew about a lot of the things that were happening in computers, and he introduced me to this language, and I looked at it and I thought, oh, okay, what does this give me that Rex doesn't already give me? And the answer was basically nothing at the time, because I didn't need any of its features. So Python sort of got left behind, and I kept on doing things with the languages I already knew. Then about 2004, 2005, I needed a scripting language to embed in a project I was doing at work, and I turned to Python. And I spent a few months putting together the necessary embedding work that we needed for this particular project. And then I said to the Python community, I came to Python list and said, hey, we've done this, and I'm not sure whether it's going to be secure enough or not. Can people have a bit of a look at it and tell me whether they can take control of the system by providing a Python script? And I think it took about 20 minutes before someone had completely taken control of that box.
All right. What about you, David?
Okay, well, I guess it was in the late 90s. I was living and working in Tokyo, Japan. I was working at a small company, and I was using Perl intensively for a couple of years, and that almost burned me out. And then I first learned about Python there, and I moved back to Canada in '98. Picked up a book. I think it was the original Python book from O'Reilly. I taught myself the language. I loved its expressiveness, how it's closest to executable pseudocode. I learned about doc strings and searched for a tool to extract doc strings a la literate programming, and that eventually turned into restructured text and docutils, which Georg Brandl incorporated into the popular Sphinx tool that uses it. And along the way, I got involved in the Python community and eventually ran a couple of Python conferences, the two that happened in Chicago, and various other things like being a PEP editor.
Very interesting. I thank you all for that. So for anybody who isn't familiar with them, can you explain what a PEP is and how they influence the Python language?
So a PEP is an acronym for Python Enhancement Proposal, and it's really the way that the Python language, and more than the language, the community and the way Python is developed, that is the central place where where all these things evolve. So, for example, when new features are to be proposed for the language, we write a PEP, which describes how this feature will work, what the backwards compatibility issues might be, the design of the feature, how it might interact with other features. It'll have a discussion about alternatives that maybe were discussed and rejected, and it'll usually have links to implementation, example implementations that people can play with before the PEP is accepted. So it's really, the main thing is for language development for new features, but there are a few other types of PEPs involved, and I guess we can talk about those later.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons for this beginning of the PEPs, Barry was there right at the beginning. This is David speaking. I came in a little bit later, but I think one of the reasons for it was to capture requirements and capture ideas so that people didn't have to keep on talking about them over and over and over again on the mailing list, because that's what was happening, right? Somebody would introduce a feature and everyone would sort of back behind their own screens would groan and say, oh, not this again. So PEPs came around to write all that stuff down and say, hey, okay, you want to add that? Okay, go and write it. We'll add it to the repository. It'll be up on the web. And from now on, whenever anybody wants to propose it, we can just say, oh, yeah, that's PEP number, that's PEP number X. Go see that. And they can either they can look at it and say, oh, it's already done, it's already been rejected, or they could pick it up and run with it and maybe finally get it implemented. Some option. But it would save people time and stop people from having to reinvent the wheel every single time and redo the discussion every single time.
And as soon as anyone says that this is going to be a wonderful, wonderful thing, instead of having 50 people saying, but what about this, but what about this, but what about backward compatibility, all those sections will be there in the PEP.
Yeah, I think we were really trying to solve a couple of problems. Email is the primary way that people discuss new features, for example, and there's lots of mailing lists to do that on. And mailing lists are great for those kinds of discussions, but they're really terrible for capturing what the current state of the design is, because you have to go, people reply and the subjects, the threads don't always match up and the subject headers sometimes ramble. And so, it's really difficult to go through, an email thread that may have 1,000 or at least several hundred emails on it and figure out, okay, well, so what have we decided right now? And that was especially true of Guido, who was really being pulled in, I think, a lot of directions. And he had a really difficult time sort of following the discussion. Okay, so we've talked about this and we've talked about that, but what did we decide? And so the PEPs, and I actually found the original email message where I announced the PEP process. It was on July 13th, 2000 to Python Dev. And so what we tried to do is we said, okay, well, we're going to have a document with as little formalism as we can get away with. So we really wanted it to be very, very lightweight, but we wanted it to capture the current state of the discussion so that Guido wouldn't necessarily have to read every single email in the thread. He could go to the PEP and he could read the PEP and he could understand what the design was proposing, and then he could give his feedback on that, give a thumbs up or a thumbs down once he was ready to pronounce on it. So, and then the other sort of point was that we wanted to capture that in a document that was in a version control system so that we would have a historical record of the evolution of that language feature. And so that's really what the PEP process was about. Now, the other interesting thing was that we were all working for CNRI at the time, and CNRI was running the IETF, which is the sort of internet standards body. And so we looked at the RFC process as a model for how we wanted the PEPs to work, but we wanted it to be much more lightweight and agile, flexible for us. So the other thing is that I tend to come up with these backronyms. So I actually, like many other things, I came up with the word PEP first, and then I retrofitted the acronym into it. But it seems to work. It's caught on, and interestingly enough, I've seen sort of the same idea adopted in a lot of other communities. Like Debian has DEPs, for Debian Enhancement Proposals. So.
Yeah, I remember the first one I think I heard about was GLEPs or something. I think it was Gentoo Linux.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So Barry, would you say that we are the PEP squad?
Yes, we certainly are very peppy.
Do you all have a bit of pep in your step?
Yes.
Every step has PEP.
And so, taking that a little further, what are the requirements for a PEP to be considered for approval, and what does the overall process look like to get it finalized?
Well, I can take this one, I guess. So for it to be considered for approval, for it to be considered at all, it has to basically fit the template. And we've got two PEPs. I think they're PEP 9 and 12, I think, are the templates. And so people can just take those and fill in the blanks, basically. And it's very simple. It just has to have some minimal requirements, and you send it into the PEP mailing list, peps@python.org, and it comes to us. Oh, and by the way, anybody listening to this, please don't try to subscribe to peps@python.org. We'll just reject it. And I'm the one who always gets to do that, so please don't do that. So you just send in the PEP, and if it fits, if it works, if it makes sense at all, we'll give it a PEP number, and then the real work begins. Then you've got to convince the community. If you haven't already been trying, you put it up on the mailing list and you try to convince everybody and try to build consensus. And once consensus is built, then you've got to get approval. And ultimate approval comes from Guido, or he might designate a deputy for some section for PEP by PEP or area by area of the language. And there's a lot of details, and they're all spelled out in PEP number 1. I think you can go from there. And
is there any sort of time limit or a lifetime on a PEP once it gets submitted before it can be finalized? Is there some sort of minimum time frame for comments or any maximum lifetime within which a PEP can be approved? No, not really. I'm sure there are PEPs that are out there that are still, awaiting final decision that are years, if not a decade old, and there are some that go through, right away. It depends on what kind of momentum you have behind it. Mm-hmm. So that's one part of the RFC process that you decided not to emulate.
That's right. That's right. And actually, some PEPs, they kind of languish for a very long time. It's a bit of a gauntlet to get your PEP approved. So it's definitely not for the faint at heart. The Python community can be, I would say they really care deeply about, new features. So, some things just the time isn't right, and they'll just sit around until, somebody else gets really fired up about it, and will bring it out of retirement or whatever, and resurrect it, and have maybe even sort of a new perspective on a particular feature, and that might be just what it needs to make it over the hump.
Well, how long did matrix multiplication hang around before it finally got implemented? The idea is a new @ operator. That's been around for a good while.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's an old one.
Well, some PEPs need a champion, right, who has to push it through, and other PEPs just need the momentum to build the community. It needs like the collective mind of the community to be changed and directed in the right direction. And that sometimes it takes time, sometimes it happens very quickly.
That's really interesting, specifically with regard to, some PEPs tend to hang around for a while and some PEPs kind of go through more quickly. When you said that, I thought about a number of years ago when I was more in tune with the Java community, how they said there was a really serious problem with the Java community equivalent of a PEP, the JSR, or at least that used to be the case. I'm not sure what they use these days. They had a real problem with, significant numbers of JSRs going essentially moribund and just kind of hanging around forever, years and years, never making progress, and like a really significant number of them, not like a mix. It was like, for a long time, people sort of started kind of, sniggering at the JSR process behind its back, saying that nothing ever happened there. So it's interesting that this model really seems to be working in the Python community.
Well, it's definitely evolved over the years. I mean, some of the early PEPs that we sort of added to the, assigned numbers and added them to the VCS were very sort of hand wavy and not really complete. And I think we learned pretty quickly that, a PEP has to be, to be submitted, it has to be pretty solid to start with. But one of the things that we've done since then, and certainly the other guys can talk about this as well, we won't just sort of accept PEPs out of the blue. I mean, I think that doesn't quite work as well. So a few years ago, there was a new mailing list called Python Ideas, right? So we have Python Dev, which is where sort of the focus of Python development occurs. But Python Ideas is the crazy, pie in the sky sort of, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we added braces and semicolons, kind of thing. And so we typically, I think, encourage people to go to Python Ideas and flesh out these ideas. And if it sort of makes it through that process favorably, then people will be encouraged to take that idea, really, codify it into a PEP and submit it as a PEP. And that's helped a lot, I think.
You're essentially dovetailing into what my next question was going to be, so I'll just throw it out there and we can continue this discussion. How has the PEP process evolved to meet challenges posed by changes in the Python community? And it sounds like this is the perfect sort of lead-in to what you guys were saying. Go ahead, Tobias.
I was just going to say that this whole process of PEPs and also seeing which ones get accepted or rejected or sit nascent for a long time would be an interesting area of anthropological research to see sort of what overall trends are happening in the language community and the broader programming community as a whole, just to sort of mine that information both for PEPs and also possibly other analogous processes in other communities.
Well, the cool thing about that is that just about the entire debate is recorded in the mailing lists and in the version control, isn't it? So there's a case for an anthropologist in the future to come back and base her dissertation on the PEP process, and everything is there. What else do you want?
I think the other change that happened, I don't know how long ago, that I think helped out a lot, because I got personally kind of burned out on being a PEP editor at some time, and fortunately we had great people like Chris and David to really take over. But once we sort of opened up the repository, the version control repository, to a wider audience, now, I mean, it used to be that all the PEP numbers had to go through an editor to be assigned. And I think it's pretty much the case that if you're a core developer, you already have commit access, you can pretty much self-assign a PEP, just pull the next PEP number and just self-assign it and check it in without.
That's right. That's a decision we made some years ago because there was just too much noise going on. Too many people that we already trusted. I mean, they were already vetted by getting the commit bit for our version control system for the core code, and if they were okay to write there, then no problem writing to the PEP repository. So yeah, just go and get the next number and do it yourself.
Yeah. And I can't remember an instance where I remember one or two cases where we might have had to reassign a number just because either we were reserving that number for some silly reason or there might have been a collision or something like that. But it's very rare that I think we have to go in and make a change to something that someone has committed for themselves.
And that raises a question for me anyway. Just curious what sort of tooling you have in place in the PEP repository for assigning those numbers, or if it's just a text document that happens to hold the last assigned number, or what sort of processes you might have in place for that.
No, we just do a file listing. We just update our local copy and do a listing and say, oh, well, the last number is X, so you get X plus 1. That's it.
And then the index is automatically built. I wouldn't want to build that manually.
Yeah, that's right. That's a great help.
Yeah, we started out, writing PEP 0 manually, and that clearly didn't scale. So I don't remember who wrote the script to generate PEP 0, but I don't know. Do either of you remember who wrote it? I'm sure we can find out.
I think it was. What's his name? I don't know. Sorry, it's like /F or something. F.
Oh,
something.
Was it Frederick Lund?
Yes. Yes, he wrote
the
it.
F-bot. Yeah, right.
The F-bot, that's right. The F-bot. He wrote it, and originally it was a script that would just turn the old style, the original style PEPs, which were just plain text documents. It would just locate, I think, the section headers and turn those into like HTML H2s or something. The rest of them were just literal blocks of pre-blocks in HTML, and it would extract the PEP number and the title and the authors and make the list out of that. I eventually took that script and modified it to process the restructured text PEPs as well, but the initial work was done by the F-bot. That's right.
Yeah, I think that was But by the way, I have to say that adding the REST format was really awesome. I mean, that was something that you did, David, and I think that really helped a lot. So.
Well, it made them much more expressive, and finally you could do things like add diagrams and that type of thing. It changed it from basically typewriter to HTML, right? So.
Yeah.
Not that diagrams are particularly common. Of recent PEPs, I can think of exactly one that actually has them, which is the whole thing on daylight saving time and all the messes that entails.
So how many reviewers are there, and how did each of you end up in that role? And also, is there a set number of editors that must be maintained? And if that is the case, how did you arrive at that number?
No, there's no set number. I think there's probably about 9 of us on the mailing list, and maybe half of those are active. I'm not very active myself. All I do personally is handle moderation on the mailing list itself. That's pretty much all I'm doing. And I think the number of PEP editors we need is at least one active.
Yes, I think that's
And
right.
as long as we have one active PEP editor, then we're good. And if we don't, then eventually somebody will notice and say, "Hey, we need a new PEP editor," and then we'll drag in a new editor.
Which is how I got involved. Yeah.
You were press ganged into it.
Yes. Guido says, "Hey, we need more PEP editors," and I go, "Oh, well, maybe I could." He goes, "Yep, right, you're in, done, grab, door slam."
I saw you raise your hand.
So what mistakes have other communities made when creating similar processes, and how has PEP learned from those mistakes? So the reason I ask that is because of exactly, I already kind of referred to this earlier, the horribly broken JSR process of a number of years ago. I didn't know if you folks had seen some of those missteps and said, well, we're not going to do that. But it sounds like you kind of, it was a case of simultaneous evolution. You guys came up with your own ways of handling things that have obviously been quite functional and successful. So that's good news in and of itself.
I think it's the case of the classic lazy programmers, right? You do the minimum possible that can work, and that's basically what it is. It's a little bit more than the minimum, but not a whole heck of a lot more.
I think you're right. Absolutely. I mean, and any changes that we've made, because if you look at like PEP 1, you'll see that there's been a few steps and some, over the years added, as some headers added and a few things like that. And that's really all just organically done. I mean, I think someone will say, well, the PEP process doesn't handle informational PEPs or process PEPs. So let's allow for a new PEP type that will describe the process for releases or something like that. So it's very organic, and I think we've settled in a really nice place where we get done what we need to get done without really a lot of overhead and burden. So.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, the PEPs we started out with two types, right? Standards track PEPs. Those are the real meat of, that's most of the PEPs. Those are the ones that describe a new feature or implementation, some standard that we're going to implement, probably. And then, of course, being programmers, we had to add a level of indirection on top of that. So we have to have PEPs that talk about PEPs, and those are the informational PEPs. So like PEP 1, which describes the process, and PEP 0, which is just a list of PEPs. And then later on, it was a few years later that we discovered that we needed a third type of PEP, which was the process PEP. So those are the documents that describe the processes surrounding Python. They proposed changes to the process. And those didn't really fit as informational PEPs. They were like actionable. They weren't just information to read and acknowledge. They were actionable, but they weren't going to be implemented in the language. They were going to be implemented in the community. So those are the three types we have now. And I think those pretty much handle everything. I haven't heard of anybody who's asked for something that doesn't fit into one of those three categories.
And have you considered renaming the informational PEPs to be meta PEPs?
No, but I think they are under the meta PEP heading in PEP 0. So the PEP 0 you'll see is organized sort of by PEP types, I think, and then there's another section that just lists them numerically. So we have a little bit of organization around the numbers. And I think you may ask about that later on. We could talk about that.
Yes, that's actually the next question, so feel free.
Well, there you go. So I know that I remember that we had talked about, trying to keep like the meta PEPs in the lower numbers. And the other interesting thing I did not remember until I went and looked at that first announcement email was that the first handful of PEPs were PEP 200, 201, 202, and 203. And PEP 200 is the one that described the Python 2.0 release schedule. which Jeremy Hilton, who was a Python Labs guy, owned, because he was, I believe he was the release manager for Python 2.0. So we sort of kind of established that PEPs and, those early PEPs were, features around 2.0, Python 2. And when Python 3 was sort of a dream, I think, in Guido's mind, or maybe a nightmare, I don't know. We said, okay, we're going to throw all these, because the joke was sort of Python 3K or Python 3000, which is like, it's a dream, it's way off in the future, and we were still working on Python 2. So we said, okay, well, all the PEPs that are going to describe new features or changes for Python 3, we're going to go in the 3000s. So if you notice, you'll see a bunch of PEPs in the 3000s, and those were the early Python 3 PEPs. And then once Python 3 became a reality, we just folded all the new stuff back into the normal numeric sequence.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, we played some games here and there. That's about it.
And there's a couple, I think, that fall outside that,
Yeah, a couple. Like there's PEP 401, for example,
right.
where the numbers had a small significance. There are a few jokes in there.
Yeah, there's a few jokes in there.
A few jokes in there, yeah.
I just realized that the PEP 160 is the Python 1.6 release schedule as well. So,
right. I think it was the idea to sort of match. So 160 would be 1.6, 200 would be 2.0, but by the time you got to like 2.1, you're already way past PEP 210 in terms of standards track. So we couldn't keep on doing that. So that sort of went out the window. Yeah. But then for Python 3, which was Pi 3K, so we went, let's just go to 3000. That'll be fine. And that was way off in the distance. So there's a huge jump between, I think the highest is probably in the 400s or 500s right now, and then the next one is in 3000.
How does the PEP process maintain its sense of humor, for example, PEP 20, while being sure to be taken seriously where it really counts?
Well, look, the language is named after a British comedy troupe, so there's got to be some humor in there somewhere. I mean, I remember in the early days, I had gotten this really awesome 2-volume set of the I think it's called Monty Python All the Scripts or something like that. It's
only the words. Only the words.
Only the words. Yeah, it's great.
I have a copy of it myself. It's a back-to-back paperback. You have to turn it, flip it over, and it's got like the half of it in one direction and half. There's got 2 front covers, and yeah, I have a copy of that on my shelf, or I used to have it, on my shelf above the computer, and I would pull it down anytime I needed variable names or example names or anything like that. So rather than foo and bar, you'd get spam and ham and eggs and bacon or something like that.
Albatross.
Yeah, albatross.
Yeah, exactly. When we had to name machines, you always come up with these naming themes, and that's what we did. We just cracked the book open, and we would see Albatross and Jimenez and Biggles, and so we'd mine those scripts for the original Python package index. And some of us still hold dear to this name, is called the Cheese Shop.
That's
right? Because,
it has no cheese.
Yes. It has no cheese. So it's a perfect name. So,
what was a really discouraging moment for me was when I was organizing the PyCon, and I asked the assembled, 1,000 Pythonistas there, how many of them understood the Monty Python jokes that we were talking about? And fewer than half, maybe like only 20% put up their hands. It's like, come on, guys, you got to know this stuff. This is integral to the culture and the community. But fewer and fewer people know about it now.
The good news, though, is today they've released it all on YouTube, free and clear, or at least a significant chunk of it. So the bottom line is now you can say, here, have YouTube links, go watch this. It's required education.
Oh, you should absolutely watch every single episode and movie because they're all brilliant.
Yep. Yes, I have the box set and a couple of the movies. I don't yet own all of the movies, but I intend to remedy that.
So I think humor is not the problem. I mean, sometimes I feel like, we've gotten a little humor challenged. And I suppose you have to be kind of careful these days about, the jokes that you make. But, I mean, I think you have to have a lightness about all this stuff, because if you don't, you can easily get bogged down. I mean, everybody's been involved in, flame wars and massive threads that get, and I think a lot of that is because people sincerely care about these systems that they're building. I mean, people are passionate about Python. We all love it very much. So you can get serious, but you got to keep that lightness. Otherwise, it gets overwhelming, So.
Definitely. So along the lines of humorous PEPs, can you share the story of PEP 401, which you have alluded to previously?
I guess I should take this one.
Yes, you should.
Okay, so here's the story for PEP 401. So it turns out, I think in 2009, I don't remember where the Python conference was in 2009. Maybe one of you remember, but
2009 was Chicago.
Chicago. Okay, so you probably were the organizer for that.
That's right.
So I remember that we realized that April 1st was going to fall in the sprints, I think.
Yep.
So I figured, okay, April 1st, right? At least the way that we write the date in the U.S. is 0401. So I had reserved 401, and I was going to write a humorous PEP, and we had actually talked about it for several years. A few of us, Guido and Brett Cannon and myself, had been talking about doing a humorous PEP, but April 1st never really fell within the Python conference. So anyway, in 2009 it did. We said, well, we got to do it this year. So I think 2 days before, or maybe the day before, I stayed up all night and wrote this PEP. But I had come up with another backronym, which I just was like throwing ideas around, and I came up with this funny word called the fluffle. I just thought it sounded funny, and then I backronymed the friendly language uncle for life. And the thing is, I wrote the PEP for Tim Peters, okay? Because Tim, I don't know how many, I hope a lot of people know Tim. Tim was a very early adopter of Python. I mean, even before me, he was probably involved from like day one, or very, very soon after Guido originally released Python. And then he kind of fell off for a while. And then when we split off Python Labs, he came and joined us. So he was a colleague of ours for many years. And I think he's kind of, he crops up every now and then in some of the discussions. But anyway, Tim is a great guy, very, very smart, really understands, he channels Guido very well. And so he was this real figure in the Python community. And so, but everybody called him Uncle Tim for who knows what reason. We just, he's just a lovable, huggable guy, right?
Well,
so
he's our curmudgeonly uncle, right?
Yes, exactly. So I wrote the PEP with Tim as the fluffle. And I sent it off to Guido and Brett, and I said, it was probably like 4 a.m. It took me a while. And I said, well, what do you think? Is this completely stupid, or is it funny? Is it appropriate? I heard nothing back. So like all the next day, nothing. And I started getting a little pissed, like, hey, I worked on this thing and I think we should go for it. And, they were like, nothing. So, then on April 1st, they released it, but they had, just like in the Monty Python script, they had scratched out Tim Peters' name and wrote my name in instead.
They scratched out Tim Peters and wrote Barry Warsaw in crayon.
Exactly. So, and I didn't know it. People started coming up to me at the conference and calling me the fluffle, and I was like, "Oh no, you didn't. You didn't do it." So that's the story.
It became a meta prank, didn't it? They turned it around and aimed it right back at the prankster.
And the prank lives on in Python 3. So for anybody who isn't aware, if you do from future import Barry as Fluffle, you get the diamond operator back.
That's right. Because see, I had these arguments with Guido, not arguments, but discussions. I really wanted him. I mean, I understood why in Python 3 that we were going to get rid of the two inequality operaters, but I like the diamond operator. So I was like, Guido, man, you should really just go for it. And so then when he chose the not equal or the bang equal, I was like, well, that just destroys Python. Everything's, everything's over now. It's a terrible language. And so I incorporated that into the PEP. I was like, well, Tim's going to take over and fix that. And then, so I don't think it was for that, but they actually, I thought it was hilarious that, not only is it in the PEP, but it's actually in the future module. So you can actually say, I want the diamond operator and use it.
It's not just in the future module. It's built into the language interpreter, isn't it?
It is.
The future module is just a thin layer on top of, it's just a way to get something out of the language itself.
Yeah, I think it actually changes the parser.
Yeah.
And as we found out recently, this makes a great test for programs that abuse future imports, because suddenly they want to import everything except Barry's Fluffle. We had this discussion on which list was it? I can't remember. I think it might have been Python list. Maybe Python Dev.
Yeah, Python Dev, I think. Mm-hmm. So there's your PEP 401 story.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that.
Indeed.
Yeah. And there are a couple of other interesting PEPs, like there's PEP 666, for example. There's a few in there.
Yeah, 404 I think is one of my favorites.
PEP not found?
Yeah, that's the
unreleased schedule. Yeah.
Yes, the Python 2.8 unreleased schedule.
That's great. So, how does the PEP process strive to prevent an undesirable level of control by any one company or other special interest group?
Anyone can write a PEP.
Yeah, anyone can write a PEP, and it has to be agreed to by the community and ultimately Guido or his deputy. So anybody can write one, but good luck getting it passed if we don't like it.
It's really interesting, and that dovetails into the next question, but I just want to say your responses to all of these kinds of questions are brilliant. They are a prime example of why sort of Python is the kind of community that it is. And it's sort of like, well, we don't have to do any of that stuff because it all just sort of works. Everyone just sort of plays nice and there's no issues. I mean, there have been, speaking in terms of other language communities, there have been instances where there are these bitter turf wars between these major companies that want to influence a language in one way or another. And it's wonderful that in Python's case that these things just don't happen for all the reasons you mentioned.
So I have one other interesting story about that. At the first Python workshop that I mentioned earlier, we had 20 people there, and we had a few who we were not allowed at the time to advertise that they were at the workshop because they were using Python as an integral part of their business, but it was their secret weapon. So they didn't want their competitors to know that they were using Python.
Right. If their competitors found out about it, then
exactly. So it's always been community-driven.
So kind of dovetailing what you just said, how much control does Guido have over the PEP process? And has a PEP ever countered Guido's wishes? How did it turn out?
It got rejected. I think I've seen quite a few of those, actually. I wrote PEP 463 about exception-catching expressions. And he said in one of his talks somewhere, this is not the sort of thing that the Python language needs. So, the PEP is not getting approved. It's that simple.
Yeah, that's part of it. I think maybe the meta answer to your question is Guido has as much control as Guido wants to have, and he divests himself of as much as he possibly can.
There's certainly lots of PEPs that are covering areas that he really doesn't care about. and I would say he doesn't care, but he also has a trust that the people who do care about that in the community will eventually do the right thing. And so he'll just say, I'll let you guys handle it, or let you folks handle it. And, you'll find the right PEP czar, the delegate. And, we usually, I think, try to get Guido to at least not disapprove of the delegate. But, if he cares enough about a particular thing, he's going to chime in and have a say. And, I think one thing that's actually pretty good is that for the most part, if Guido says this is not a feature for Python, that is enough to shut down the discussion, which I think is really important to also not continue to discuss things that really aren't going to have any chance of being added to Python.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting. I was just thinking as you guys were talking about another kind of example in this same vein in terms of in the Ruby community, Mats is kind of the, I don't want to say equivalent because they're two very different languages and two very different communities, but he's sort of the benevolent, dictator for life, although no one has explicitly elected him beduffle as the Python community has Guido. But he basically runs the C Ruby team, and that defines the behavior of the language. And there's been actually a fair bit of frustration because you have these sort of alternative implementations of Ruby, and they're just trying to sort of make sense of how Ruby should work. And there's been quite a lot of back and forth around what are the behaviors of the language? How will they change? It just feels like Guido, as part of, the benevolent aspect of his role, has done a really good job in sort of, yes, the buck stops there. He is the ultimate decider, but he also makes it really easy, it seems to me, for people to work with him and to have, alternate Python implementations that behave well and are relatively compatible. I just think it's a really, he deserves major props for being able to guide this community in a relatively harmonious way, without seeing that kind of strain.
Yeah, so just two thoughts on that. I mean, Guido has an amazing language design sense. I mean, I think he'd probably admit that, he doesn't always get it right, and I think Python 3 was an attempt to sort of rectify some of the biggest warts. But he gets things right a lot of the time, most of the time. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really garnered the respect of the community because, honestly, if people didn't respect Guido, Python wouldn't be the language that it is today, and the community wouldn't be the community that it is today. It would have fractured long ago. So, I think that the people who come into Python and really like Python are seeing Guido's, the manifestation of Guido's language design sense, and for the most part, it's been really, really good, and everybody just gets behind it. So it's not so much a matter of voting for Guido or not voting for Guido. It's just that it's his vision, and we all like it enough that it just makes sense for him to be the person that continues to do that.
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes perfect sense. And it's a design issue, and we all know that design by committee doesn't work. I mean,
exactly.
you can have proposals by committee, you can have implementations by committee, whatever. You can hash things out by committee, but
he dropped off again.
Yep.
But you can't really even have a proposal by committee. Even a proposal needs its one champion, ultimately.
Yeah.
Yes.
If I might add one other thought, because what you mentioned about Ruby and the alternative implementations. So the interesting thing was that, many, many years ago, Jim Huguenin, I don't remember exactly where he was at the time, but he was a researcher who was involved in the Java language. And he started a discussion, and I don't remember exactly where. It might have been on the mailing list or it might have been a private email about this idea that he had to build an implementation of Python on the JVM. And my recollection, which could, of course, be completely faulty, but was that Guido said, not only don't do it, but it's impossible. You can't do it. It can't be done. And if anybody knows Jim Huguenin, that's a challenge, right? He's like, nope, okay.
Them's fighting words.
Them's fighting words, exactly. So Jim did it. He implemented Python on the JVM, and that's why we have, at the time it was JPython and turned out to be Jython later on. But one of the things that forced Guido to do, and I think it was really critically important for Python's success, was to come to grips with this idea of what parts of Python are implementation details for any specific language implementation, and which are the definition of the language, what things can you have or not have and still call it Python. And, Jim, I remember, cause eventually CNRI hired Jim, and, I remember, discussions about, these corner cases of the implementation, of the CPython implementation, like, for example, how under dels might get called when an object goes, what is the lifetime of an object? Can you define, because CPython, of course, has a reference counting implementation, whereas the JVM is built on top of the garbage collector, the JVM garbage collector. So what parts of that lifetime of an object is part of the Python language definition, and what are implementation details that the implementations can take care of? Can do whatever makes sense for them. And a lot of those discussions, you see them in IronPython, and you see them, in PyPy. Those are things where, it has to have this to be called Python. And maybe they're, a version or two behind, and maybe they're, CPython tends to be the one that is the trailblazer, but, eventually they all have these features and these semantics. Otherwise, they aren't Python. You can't call them Python. And that was something that really important that I think Guido realized and embraced. And he was sort of forced into that position of trying to define what's implementation and what's language definition.
Well, and moreover, as you say, he was actually willing to do the work. I think that's a really key distinction, because that is exactly some of the frustrations that we're seeing play out, or actually they've kind of died down now because the alternate implementations kind of just gave up. But one guy in particular, the maintainer of Rubinius, I forget his name, really had this huge effort saying, let's create a specification for the Ruby language. Let's create a test suite so that all the alternate, implementations can conform to this spec and play nice. And the, prevailing opinion on the Ruby core team was basically, we don't want to be tied down that way. Our implementation defines the behavior of the language, and kind of that's it. And I think it really hurt Ruby. I think that these alternate, implementations still exist, but they kind of, a number of them basically said, well, we're just not going to work quite as hard to be compatible with the mainline. And I think that has hurt adoption of those alternate implementations.
I think you see the same thing in the Perl community. The implementation of Perl is the definition of the language. And I think you're right. I think in Python, there's lots of people who use Jython, and there's lots of people who use PyPy and IronPython, and a lot of the code that you can just go out and get from the package index, or a lot of the applications that run on CPython, with here and there changes, they'll run on those alternative implementations, and I think that really has helped Python get into areas that it wouldn't have gotten into had that not been the case.
Yeah, it's like what was always said about Java, right? Write once, run anywhere. It never seemed to work there, but it works in Python, doesn't it?
It does.
So, redirecting the conversation a bit, I suppose. Thank you all for that great conversation about Python and its implementations and histories. So what is your favorite PEP and why? We'll go in the order we went before. So Barry, why don't you take it first?
Well, I think my favorite PEP is PEP 20. I mean, you got to go for that one, right? That's the one that Tim, once again, Tim Peters channeled Guido so well, and codified that, and it was just the kind of thing where he wrote it and everybody was like, yeah, someday maybe I'll tell you about the funny story about import this and PEP 20, but anyway, I really like PEP 20 quite a bit.
Well, I do know that the import this module is actually, if you go and look at the source, the text is actually rote 13 and quote coded, and there's a rote 13 decoder built into the interpreter to be able to print import this. So
yeah.
Yes. And the Python devs do not want anybody tampering with that, no matter how many neat features you might want to add to it. I know, but I asked about one.
Well, it's actually PEP 20 because, if I remember correctly, there's actually 19 Zen. But
Zen cones and aphorisms, yeah.
Exactly. But Tim, I think in his original email, said that there's sort of this slot for the 20th one, but it's undefined, and it will always remain undefined. So that's why it became PEP 20.
It's left for future expansion.
Now, I got if you might indulge me for just a minute, I'll tell you about import this.
Absolutely.
Please do.
I don't remember which workshop. I tend to think it was one of the before they were called PyCons. But we were looking for a slogan for the T-shirt, and so this was when we were Python Lab. So we were a small group, five of us, I think. And so we put out a call and we said, hey, if you have an idea for, a slogan, send it to us, and then we'll, go through them and pick the one we like, and then maybe have a vote on it or something like that. And so we really didn't think we were going to get that many. And we got hundreds and hundreds of submissions, and most of them were really bad. I mean, really bad. So, as sort of a team, I'm sure Guido probably checked out like right away. He was like, I want nothing to do with this, and eventually it kind of fell to Tim and myself to cull through all these submissions to try to pick the one that we were going to go with. And Tim, of course, had the brilliant idea that we were just going to do a bisection. So Tim would take the list and he'd cut out half of them and send the list to me, and I'd cut out half of the remaining, and figuring if we did that enough, we'd end up with the one that won. So we went through this process, and we ended up with one that said something like, "Let's we study Python programming." It didn't make any sense. It was, submitted probably by a non-English speaker, but we just really enjoyed it. It was just so enthusiastic and funny. So
was that in the days of Can I Has Cheeseburger, maybe?
No, I think it was before that, actually. And one of the ones that didn't make the cut was import this. For whatever reason, it didn't. And we ended up with one which wasn't either one of those two, that once we finished the bisection, we just didn't like. It wasn't very good. So Tim and I went through a couple of those last few, and we latched onto import this, and we said, that's great. I think at the time Michael Jackson, we just had these images of Michael Jackson, dancing and grabbing his crotch and saying, import this, So whatever it was really funny, and we liked it. And we thought, what we can do is we can actually make it a module. And if I remember correctly, it was like right before Python 2.1 or 2.2 was released. And so what we did is we turned off the version control system notifications and wrote the ROT13 and checked this thing in as an Easter egg. Import this as an Easter egg. And then we released Python with this Easter egg in it that nobody knew about. And so we figured, man, somebody's going to find it, right? You know, because we actually had published PEP 20 and we had this import this that nobody really knew about. And nobody found it. And we actually, I think we went to the whatever workshop or PyCon it was at the time, and nobody said anything. So clearly our Easter egg worked. And so we actually had to go back and tell people that, you know, there's this Easter egg in Python, and if you import it, it prints out PEP 20. So that, you know, it was just like one of those crazy things that you know, happen if you're locked in a room together.
And there have been some other Easter eggs that have made it in since then. The one that I'm thinking of right now is the import anti-gravity from the XKCD comic.
Yes.
Yeah, and import anti-gravity refers to import this, doesn't it? I think it does, doesn't it? Maybe I'm mistaken.
I know there are 2 XKCD references. There is another one. There's one somewhere about geolocation.
Oh, there's more than 2 XKCD references to Python.
No, XKCD references in Python.
Oh, in Python.
Oh, no, I see. The anti-gravity module has a geohash function. That's where the other one is.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah, if you import anti-gravity, it pops up the XKCD that in your browser that talks about Python. And
Yes.
Yeah, I was running the conference chair when that came out, and we were like, you know, the biggest decision of any conference is what do you put on the T-shirt, right? Mm-hmm. And so we were debating what we're going to put on the T-shirt. I can't remember if it was 2008 or 2009. It was one of the two, and then Randall Munroe published this XKCD number. What is it? 357. And within seconds, you know, I got it on my feed. I read it. I thought, oh, this is it. And then within seconds, my email started going out. Bing, 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 bing. Have you seen XKCD? Have you seen X? We've got to get it. We've got to get it. And somebody was able to contact Randall Munroe, and we got an original pristine copy. He draws them out on paper and scans them in at high resolution. And I spent several hours removing all of the little noise bits from the original high-resolution copy so that we could print a really nice copy on the back of the T-shirt.
Oh, wow.
Awesome.
That's amazing. All right. Chris, what is your favorite PEP?
PEP 479, definitely, because Guido asked me to co-author that with him, and I got to basically work closely with one of the greatest people in the community on this proposal to deal with a recognized problem. And it was after that I was invited to become a PEP, or not specifically invited, but it was opened up. We need more PEP editors, and I put my hand up, and Guido said, yeah, I was hoping you'd volunteer. So it was pretty much invited to become a PEP editor.
And PEP 479 is?
It's changing the handling of stop iteration inside generators. So if a generator would leak a stop iteration exception, it becomes a runtime error instead.
Yeah, I remember that one. I think I probably had to fix something in Debian that might have had some package. I don't even remember which one.
Well, until you're shipping Python 3.7, it's not mandatory.
Right.
All right. David, what's your favorite PEP?
Well, I guess I could say that it's PEP 257 docstring conventions, which is where I've got co-authorship with Guido. And basically all I did is rip the docstring convention section of an essay that he'd written and made it into a PEP. But I've got to go with PEP 20 also. The Zen of Python. That's the best thing out there. That's something that, you know, what other programming language has the philosophy of the design of the language built into the language as an Easter egg? It's just genius. And something that's bothered me for a long time, and I've actually done some talks at local user groups about this, is that people misconstrue what the Zen of Python is all about. It's not the Zen, it's not the rules, it's not the Zen of writing code in Python. It is it is the philosophy behind the design of Python. It's a very subtle but important distinction.
That's an excellent point.
And I've had confirmation of that right from the horse's mouth. I wrote to Tim, and he replied, which is getting rarer and rarer, I think, these days. But it's true. So it's the Zen of Python, the design of Python, the language, and not how you're supposed to write code in Python. Because, come on, how many of our programs have namespaces implemented in the program itself, apart from the ones that we inherit from Python, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, and it's often misquoted. I can't even count the number of times I've heard people say, refer to Python as saying, "Oh, there's only one way to do things," and that's not at all the spirit that was intended. Every time I hear that, I cringe.
Yeah,
and just for clarification to everyone listening, what it says is there should be one obvious way to do things. And as a parenthetical remark, I don't remember if it's specifically in the Zen of Python, but the parenthetical remark is that there may be many, many ways to do things, but there should be at least one obvious way of doing it.
Yeah, it's written, there should be one, and preferably only one, obvious way to do it.
Yes.
Yeah, although that way may not be obvious at first, unless you're Dutch.
Yes.
And if you look carefully at the text, you'll notice that they're em dashes, double dashes used to separate it out as syntax. And if you look at the poem, the double dashes are done in 3 different ways. And that is entirely intentional.
I did not know that. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
It's really a shame that there's no humor in the Python community.
Yeah. Okay. And so, taking a slightly different direction, what, in your opinion, has been the most important or far-reaching PEP, whether it was approved or not?
Let's go in reverse order.
Okay.
Oh, you're going to put me on the hook this time. Oh, I don't know. I don't even follow these things anymore, to tell you the truth. The most important, most far-reaching.
In your opinion or in your experience, and again, whether it was approved or not, so it could be just something that introduced an important idea that fostered some conversation within the community.
Well, being forced into the first slot, I get to take the easy answer, and I get to answer, hey, it's PEP 20. It's the PEP that encoded the philosophy behind the design of the language. So anybody steps out of line, all you have to do is point them at PEP 20 and say, go read this. Read it over and over and over again until you understand it, until you understand why we're not going to add braces to the language, or why we're not going to do this or that, because it's not beautiful, it's not simple, it's not flat, it's not sparse, it's not readable, whatever the case may be. That, I think, is the most important part of the language, is the philosophy behind it, and PEP 20 writes that all down. It's all there. That's
Chris.
My answer, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you. Chris, what about you?
I'm going to pick a slightly odd choice here. I had to go look up the number, but it's PEP 466, where network security enhancements for Python 2.7 get permitted, because it's a strange pairing of backward compatibility with security improvements in a Python version that represents the promise of Python dev of stability. This is not, okay, well, you're going to have to change your code because Python 3.5 is changing something. This is, your code should keep running, but we're going to make it more secure. That one had a lot of debate around it, and people saying things like, well, what if we just bite the bullet and release a Python 2.8 and various other options around it. But I think this is the right way of doing things.
It's a case of practicality beating purity, isn't it?
All right, so I've just tied back in with PEP 20.
There you go. Everything does.
All roads lead to PEP 20.
Yeah.
PEP 8 leads to PEP 20 as well.
Yes.
Well, PEP 8 was going to be my choice.
Yeah, I agree. That definitely is a very far-reaching and important one, because I think between PEP 8 and PEP 20, they beautifully encapsulate what it means to be a Pythonista.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I have very mixed feelings about PEP 8 as well, because I think in similar ways to PEP 20, people take it the wrong way.
Yes.
They misinterpret what PEP 8 is trying to say.
So what is PEP 8 again?
PEP 8 is the style guide for Python code. But the important thing that people forget is that it's the style guide for Python code that goes in the standard library. It's not what it wasn't certainly originally meant to be the guidelines for all Python code in the entire universe, and we have tools like there's an actual PEP 8 tool that will go through and try to say, oh, you violate this rule and you violate that rule, and in some sense it's good that you can kind of walk up to almost any Python code and read it. I think more of that is based on what I think is Guido's genius observation, which is that code is written a lot more, way more than it's read way more than it's written. So, people read Python code 1,000 times more than they write it. And at least I do. And so to make Python readable, and to design a language that is meant to be readable is great. Now, of course, there's a lot of differences in, how, the style of Python should be written. And there's tools, and I think that kind of can constrain people too much. And it certainly can make certain projects kind of not so much fun to be involved in. But it was really originally designed to be, if we're going to add this module to the standard library, here are the coding conventions. And this is the style for the standard library Python code.
You know what, though? I think there's a lot of really good evidence out there that says that even if this was not originally designed to be the overall style guide for the language, that there is a great deal of good for any given language in saying this is a standard format into which source code, if not must, then perhaps should be placed, right? Like, I feel like languages like Go, and just as an example, there is one way to format Go. And many, many people feel very strongly that is to the language's benefit, right? And I feel like the fact that PEP 8 has become the de facto standard for how to format your Python, such that if you use PyCharm or Emacs or even Vim or any number of other tools, you can just basically say, yeah, make my code PEP 8, and it will just sort of automagically do the right thing and thus be more readable to other people. Agreeing on standards like this, it's bound to annoy virtually everyone. But I think there's a lot of evidence out there that says that having something like this is a real net win, that we're all better off with it as opposed to without it.
Yeah, it definitely provides some consistent expectations for anybody coming into a Python code base. And it definitely is useful as a guideline, though I definitely agree people can often be too dogmatic about it. And Raymond Hedinger did a wonderful talk about this at the PyCon 2015 of, PEP 8 is useful, but, it's not gospel. It's not the letter of the law. It's just a suggestion.
Yeah, it should, not must.
And I think the other important thing about PEP 8 is what it doesn't say as well. And there have been lots of discussions about, should we add this particular style question to PEP 8 and settle it once and for all? And there's been, as many things where we've said, no, that it's not appropriate to go into PEP 8 and people should be able to do what they want there as, prescriptive rules added to PEP 8. So it's certainly an influential document that really has, spread far and wide. And I think it's important to keep it in perspective. Use it absolutely, when it's appropriate. And, don't worry so much if there's things it doesn't say,
I think that makes a lot of sense. So what was the strangest or most extreme PEP proposal you've ever seen?
Okay. probably, I would have to say, at least in recent times, the proposed enhancement to the F-string interpolation that allows automatic escaping for whatever context it might happen to be in. Again, I had to look this one up because I didn't know the number, but it's 501. And there's this system of allowing shell quoting, SQL quoting, HTML quoting, etc. And you just magically include these tokens and something somehow knows to escape them appropriately in whatever way. It's a nice idea, but it is so different from what we currently have that I suspect this one's going to be the next thing that lies around for 10 years.
It sounds like shades of Tickle, honestly.
I think it's in 3.6, isn't it? I think it got accepted in
the basic format strings did, and actually I've been using them some because I run 3.6 here. But the extended thing that automatically escapes shell or SQL or something, that's deferred.
Yeah, I remember seeing this PEP show up on my radar, and I was actually fairly excited about the F strings. I didn't notice the bit about the escaping, but being able to automatically interpolate variables into a string just by having the F prefix, I was quite interested in, because there are certainly some times where having the full .format method call can be unnecessarily verbose.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. So Barry, how about you?
Well, I think that's an excellent example because it is very different than Python, or what people are sort of used to Python. I don't know. I think there have been some pretty extreme ones that haven't made it into the repository. So, but I think some of the ones that I think are out of the ordinary, but could be just as influential, are some of the recent PEPs about changing the workflow. I'm thinking PEP, they're in the 500s, 501 maybe, and 507, something like that. One of the things that I think we're sort of struggling with is how to, keep Python vibrant for the next 20 years. And so much has changed about software development since Guido released Python that, if we don't continually question how we're building Python and how we're accepting contributions, and what version control system and where we're hosting things and all those kinds of questions, we're not going to keep, getting new blood into the community. And that's vital for keeping any, especially an open source language, vibrant. So, some of us old timers, we need the young blood to come in and help us, keep Python alive for the next 20 years. And I think those PEPs are really critical to making things welcoming and open, and embracing some of the newer workflows that people are used to in creating open source software. So.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the great things about Python and its community is that as a whole, we're all very pragmatic and open to accepting that, the way that we're doing things now isn't necessarily how they should always be done far into the future, and that in order to maintain viable, we do need to make sure that we remain welcoming and that we continue to accept new ideas and incorporate them into the language so that we can continue to use this wonderful language for, throughout our careers and the careers of those to come.
Yeah, and there's controversy as well because, people, and nobody likes to change their workflow, something that their fingers are sort of comfortable with. But, so how do you make it so that, people who are used to doing things in a certain way won't just give up in frustration because everything's changed? It's a tricky balance.
All right. And David, how about you?
Well, I think I'm going to propose PEP 666. Reject foolish indentation. And the number should give you a clue here. This was a PEP that that was submitted with the intention of having it rejected, just to shut some people up. It had to do with the mixing of tabs and spaces in Python code, and just to say, you know what, do what you want to do, and don't and just leave us the heck alone. And here it is. It's encoded. It's all spelled out, and let's just reject the damn thing and move on with our lives. So I like the way that it was, that the system was sort of subverted and used in this way, without any intention of having it actually implemented. It was just like, propose it, reject it, move on.
Yeah, that's a great way to short circuit a lot of anger as well, because rather than doing any sort of attacks on anybody or finger pointing, you're just saying in a very non-confrontational way, this is silly, let's move on.
Yeah, exactly.
So before we move to the picks, are there any questions that we didn't ask that you think we should have, or anything that you would like to bring up?
Mine's a blank.
Okay. All right. So with that, we will move on to the picks. And so for my first pick today, I'm going to choose the Wagtail CMS from the developers over at Torchbox. It is a Django module that has a lot of really great CMS functionality that it seems to be really well designed and well thought out. I'm actually in the process of using it to rewrite the site for this podcast, so I've been enjoying it so far. The documentation is very well structured and put together, so I'm excited to get to the end result and start actually using it in my day-to-day workflow for the site. For my next pick, I'm going to choose the Disney Pixar movie Inside Out. I just watched it recently with my kids, and it's just a really well-done movie, great storyline, really interesting treatment of a lot of psychological principles and personification of our emotions. So I highly recommend it. It's got something in it for everybody. And my last pick today is the Spark podcast from the Canadian Broadcast Corporation. It is a podcast that does a really good job of sort of doing a reality check, particularly for all of us working in technology, and just taking a step back to see what kinds of effects all of our rapid innovation is having on us, socially, politically, ecologically, and seeing, extrapolating into the future what kinds of effects these different technologies will have going forward. So it's very thought-provoking, very well put together, excellent production quality. So I highly recommend everybody listen to it. And with that, I will pass it to you, Chris.
Very cool. I just wanted to quickly second Inside Out. My wife and I went to see that, and I'm usually the one who runs around gushing about the latest Pixar film, but it was really nice to see her actually recommending that movie to people. And we noticed at the end that it was made with the Institute of Mind Studies. It's definitely a thought-provoking movie. We talked about it for a few weeks afterwards, and it still comes up from time to time. It's definitely, don't disregard it because it's an animated movie. It's as Tobias said, it has something for everyone. So my first pick is in the same vein. It's a movie. It is a movie that is out now in theaters called Trumbo, and it's about a writer who really sort of bucked the whole blacklist House Un-American Affairs Committee trend during that really dark era in America's history. And I feel like given a lot of the discussion that's going on now about some of the, trade-offs between keeping us safe and, our individual rights, I feel like it's really important for people to recognize that these things can happen here. It's not totally factually accurate, but that should not get in the way of you going to see it, because it definitely tells the story very well, in my opinion. And there's some great acting there. My next pick is a YouTube playlist called Kivy Crash Course. I'm a huge fan of Kivy. It's one of the things when people look at me and say, well, what's so big about Python? What's the big deal? It's just another scripting language. And I pull out Kivy and show them how you can create really truly cross-platform UIs across desktop and mobile and, in a few minutes flat. It's a really impressive piece of tech that really showcases the power of Python. And this series of YouTube videos is just a really great sort of gentle introduction to using it that shows you how to build an app and build it for the various platforms very easily. Good stuff. My last pick might strike some people as kind of odd. I personally have been very, very concerned of late that we here in America in particular are becoming a fear-driven society, and I think that's a huge mistake. I think as opposed to just sort of being awash in this media craze of images that cause people to live their lives constantly worrying about what might jump out from around the next corner. Let's sort of educate ourselves and actually understand the situation, what's happening, what some of the motivations are, and what we as individual people can do to make our society a better place. So it's a podcast called the Jihadology Podcast, and it really goes into some interesting depth in the Islamic Jihad movement around the world and all the individual groups, not just ISIS, that make up a part of it, and what some of their motivations are, what some of their history is. And I just feel like, know thy enemy is an important thing to keep in mind. So that's it for me. Barry, what do you have for us for picks?
Well, my first pick, I suppose a lot of people may know about, but I'm kind of surprised at how many people aren't really aware of these tools that, for me, writing Python code are absolutely like the first things I add to any empty, Git repository, right? And that is Tox and Nose2. I think they're really great tools. Tox is a tool that sort of sets up virtual environments and runs the code testing in each of those virtual environments in a really convenient way. So if you're going to write a library that you're going to say, hey, this is going to be Python 2.7, 3.4, and 3.5 compatible, you can set up your environments so that all those virtual environments are managed for you and your tests run on all of those. And I have to write a tox.ini file that, kind of like as the first thing after a setup.py. And I'll put up, and the plug for Nose2 is really, for me, there's lots of different test runners. I like Nose2 because I really like the plugin system, and I use that to have a really rich both doc test and unit test environment. So, and then I'll just put in another plug for, hey, port to Python 3. You should be doing this. This is really, you will love Python 3. So, my second pick is the show Jessica Jones, which is on Netflix. You can binge watch it, and I've been binge watching it. I'm not quite done with the first season, but I've really enjoyed it. It's been quite entertaining. It's sort of it's in the Marvel world of superheroes, and I think the acting is excellent, and there's this sort of darker, more introspective side to the plot and to the characters that you don't always see in a superhero based movie or TV show, and I'm really enjoying that. And the main actress was Jesse Pinkman's girlfriend in Breaking Bad, and you'll see a cameo by a Doctor Who in there as well. So it's really quite a fun time. And my last pick is something that my brother-in-law actually loaned me, and I've been listening to these and just devouring them in the car. It's a 5 sort of series set where each series has 20 CDs, and it's called The Joy of Science. It's taught by it's basically an audio lecture. And each lecture is about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, so easily consumable. It's taught by Professor Robert Hazen, Hazen, from George Mason University. And it takes you through the very basics of science, like the scientific method. And then they talk about, everything from the discovery of electrons and electromagnetism and thermodynamics, and then the different models of the atom, the Rutherford model of the atom, and then the Bohr model of the atom, which is closer to observable phenomenon. and all the way up through, special and general relativity and quantum mechanics and chemistry. And the lectures just build in such a way that I think they really, I've always been into those kinds of topics. But there's been a lot that I've learned as well about, what is chemistry? How do the different phases of matter manifest themselves in our everyday lives? So I've really enjoyed this CD set, and I highly recommend it for anybody who's into that kind of thing.
So just real quick, we just watched the first episode of Jessica Jones, and it is awesome sauce. We really like it a lot. And with regards to the joy of science, I just want to make a note that you are the second guest that we've had in recent times to pick one of the great courses. Because when I just looked up the URL for that, I saw that it was part of that series. And we just had a guest just a couple of episodes ago pick the ancient history course in the great courses. So obviously there's some really amazing stuff there.
So Chris, what about you? What do you have for picks?
Oh, I have a favorite place that I point people to anytime they're confused about Git, which is the Git man page generator. It uses Markov chaining to generate some remarkably plausible man pages for Git subcommands. I strongly recommend at least browsing it for a little while. When you think you understand everything, there's proof that you don't.
Yeah, I've taken a look at that, and it's definitely quite humorous.
Oh, yeah. And my second pick is dailymtg.com, where you get articles about Magic the Gathering. The design articles by Mark Rosewater actually tie in very well with good design in software as well. He's talking about game design of something that is easily as complicated as a full-size Python project. And it's great to read a slightly different look at design. Oh, and I'd also like to second the recommendation for Inside Out. It's awesome.
David, what do you have?
Okay, well, I'll third the Inside Out. I just saw it for the first time on Saturday, and it was really good.
No spoilers.
No spoilers. No, it's very good. But as for my picks, okay, I'm sure that a subset, if not the entire set of my picks, has been on here before, and I'm ashamed to say that I haven't listened to every single one of your episodes. I have listened to many of them, but not every single one. Okay, my first one is a documentary called Tim's Vermeer. It's a mind-blowing documentary about an inventor named Tim Jennison. He's the man behind the video toaster and Lightwave 3D. And it's about his obsession with the paintings of the 17th century Dutch artist Johannes Vermeer. So Tim Jennison, he noticed things about these paintings that, along with his expertise in video and graphics, computer graphics, sort of caused an itch in his mind, and he set out to scratch the itch. He set out to replicate the process by which Vermeer may have created his incredibly photorealistic paintings, hundreds of years before photography was invented. And when I first saw what he came up with, the very crude initial version, my jaw just dropped to the floor. And so this is a documentary narrated by Penn Jillette and directed by Teller of Penn and Teller fame. So that's my first pick. My second pick is a novel called Ready Player One. It's a science fiction novel by Ernest Cline that incorporates a plethora of references to 1980s pop culture, especially video games. It's great fun. It's an absolute blast of a read. A film is currently in pre-production to be directed by Steven Spielberg and is scheduled for release in 2 years, December 2017. But I'd highly recommend reading the book first because chances are the movie's going to be a dud. And if it's not, then you'll still benefit. I have a third pick. It's another documentary, also partly by Penn Jillette. It's called The Aristocrats. It's a documentary about a joke told by comedians amongst themselves. It's the dirtiest, filthiest, most obscene, and funniest thing I've seen in a long time. The joke starts, a man walks into a talent agent's office and says, "Have I got an act for you?" And I won't say any more because everything else it would be working blue.
It goes downhill from there, but it is wonderful.
Does.
Oh, it's so funny. It's so funny. You'll be laughing. If you can handle obscenity, and this is obscene, okay?
Yes, it is.
It's incredibly obscene. If you can handle obscenity, then it's really funny. If you can't handle obscenity, avoid it like the plague. And I have a couple of more quick little ones. One is something I just discovered today. It's called Scientific Songs of Praise at scientificsong.com. It's basically classic Christmas and holiday songs rewritten with secular scientific lyrics. And they've got YouTube videos. They're releasing them one every day or one every week or something until Christmas, and then they're going to release CDs. And I'm going to get a copy for myself. It's really cool. I mean, rather than Oh Holy Night, it's Oh Satellite. And the video for that, I mean, I just teared up watching it. It was really cool. And my fifth and final pick is another podcast called Hollywood Babylon. This is a regular listen for me whenever they pull it out. It's also obscene, I guess. It's got some foul language, but it's really, really funny. It's Kevin Smith and Ralph Garman, these two guys who just go to town on Hollywood stuff. It's like Hollywood, what was it? It's Hollywood Babble On, BABBLE on. It's like Hollywood gossip, and they take no prisoners. It's a lot of fun. So that's it for me.
I wanted to add one interesting thing. You know, you mentioned Ready Player One, which it's an excellent book. If I remember correctly, the music of the Canadian rock band Rush is featured fairly prominently in that book.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
And just today, Neil Peart, the drummer, announced his retirement.
Oh, no.
So Rush is probably done with.
They're getting on in age, as all the rockers from the 70s.
Yeah.
Your mention of the Scientific Songs of Praise reminded me of a piece that I came across recently, Steve Martin singing his Hymn for Atheists. So I added a link to that in my picks.
Oh, thank you. I have not heard of that one, and I love Steve Martin. He's a funny guy.
He is.
So I just wanted to mention Tim's Vernier. I actually haven't seen that documentary, and I'm totally going to hunt it down because I'm a Video Toaster fan from way back. I mean, I remember the New Tech demo. It's funny because earlier on when Barry, I think you mentioned the next step, and Chris, you mentioned OS2, all I thought to myself is, now I need someone to mention the Amiga, and my retro geek, past will be complete. And David, you came really close. You didn't mention it explicitly by name, but you mentioned, Tim, the inventor of the Video Toaster, which it was a coprocessor card that ran on the Amiga platform, so we're going to call it a trifecta and deem it a win.
All right. Well, this has definitely been a lot of fun. I really appreciate all of you coming on the show to talk to us and banter about the PEP process and various other things. So for anybody who wants to follow you and keep in touch with what you guys are up to or learn more about the PEPs, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Oh, wow. Well, if you're specifically interested in the PEP process, I would make sure, and I'm sure most of the people who are listening to this are subscribed to Python Dev and Python Ideas. That's really kind of, I think, the best way to stay in touch with the Python community. The other thing I'll mention is, I forget what the email list is, but all new bugs that are opened on the tracker get sent to an email to a mailing list, and if you want to stay in touch with what's happening in the Python world, get on that mailing list and get on Python Dev and Python Ideas, or follow them through Gmail, because that you'll have your finger on the pulse of everything that's happening in the Python world. If you want to stay in touch with me personally, I rarely blog, but when I do, it's wefearchange.org, all one word.
That's awesome.
And Chris, what about you?
I also don't blog a huge amount, but when I do, it's rosuav.blogspot.com. It's ROSUAV. If you really want to know what I'm doing, then you could follow me on GitHub or something, because there's a lot happening there. But I don't think there's much of particular interest.
All right. And David, what about you?
Well, I've been intending to start a new blog for several years now and just haven't had enough around to it. But let's see, I guess you could, to see links to everything that I am and that I have done, you could go to david.goodger.org, and that has links to everything else if they move around. My main website is on python.net/tilde-goodger. So squiggly tilde, the one just under the escape key on your keyboard. Goodger, and that's linked to from david.goodger.org. I don't tweet. I don't blog much lately. I don't Instagram. I'm asocial.
All right. Well, again, thank you all very much. It has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
It's been a lot of fun. Thanks so much.
It's been fun. Thanks for putting out a really good podcast.
Thank you.